Before the Rings of Power, there were the Silmarils. Before Sauron, there was his master, Morgoth. Before Aragorn and Arwen, there was Beren and Luthien. Welcome to Window on the West, where we explore all the ages of Tolkien's Middle-earth, with your hosts, Jonathan Watson, Michael Grumbine, and Dan Coates.
Thanks for joining us today as we continue our journey through the Silmarillion. My name is Jonathan Watson. I'm here from theonering.com, and I'm here along with my co-hosts, Michael Grumbine and Dan Coates.
Hey.
And today we're going to be reading through Of Feanor and the Unchaining of Melkor, a relatively short chapter, but I think there's enough to kind of chew on for long enough. And speaking of long enough, but before we do that, we're going to jump into...
All that is gold does not glitter.
And today we're going to be doing a little bit of trivia and seeing how well Michael and Dan know The Lord of the Rings. But we're not talking about plot or people or places. We're talking about numbers. So, numbers. And these aren't numbers of like how many languages did Tolkien come up with, or how many sons did Feanor have. We're talking more real world numbers. So just jump right into it. The first question, and I'm not going to give you choices either. You just have to. Whoever's closest will win the prize of glory and fame.
Is this like Price is Right rules? It's closest without going over, or
no? I don't want anybody guessing one. So we'll just. So here's the question: approximately how many copies of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings have been sold combined? How many copies of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings have been sold?
I presume they're talking worldwide. This is not
worldwide. Every possible translation, everything through all time.
Now that's interesting.
Yeah.
I have simply no idea. I will guess 65 million.
65 million.
I will guess 85 million.
85 million. All right. They're not good guesses. Dan, though, you were closer. The actual number is 250 million, approximately.
Whoa.
250 million. Wow. So, and I'm not sure. I couldn't figure out if this was combining. This is probably including copies of The Fellowship of the Ring, Two Towers, and The Return of the King, and then also one copy of the Lord of the Rings, because you can buy them in separate, right, as one full book or as 3 books. And even some issues of like 6 books. But yeah, 100 million of The Hobbit and 150 million of The Lord of the Rings. That's quite a few.
And
I'm glad I underguessed.
And the Kindle and the audiobooks, they don't count.
Oh, you know, I didn't dive in that deep. It wasn't as important to me. All right, second question. How many unauthorized copies were printed in the U.S. due to a perceived copyright loophole of Lord of the Rings? How many unauthorized copies, meaning that Tolkien didn't make any money off this year, they were just trying to like scam them?
U.S. Okay, so probably the U.S.-based sales are the largest. English sales would be good too, but probably U.S.-based sales are the largest. So,
and this only went on, I'll tell you, it only happened in the 60s for a short amount of time. But
I was going to say it's got to be like, how about 150,000 copies?
All right, Dan?
85 million.
I'm just going
to stick every one of your previous guesses copies were unauthorized. That's perfect.
All right, 85 million, Dan. Dan is not right. However, Michael, you're spot on. 150,000. That's the number that was approximately reported. Good
because
job.
Michael Grumbine did it.
It runs in the family.
If I was alive in the 60s, that would have been
random. It's a good thing I didn't go multiple choice. Probably would have gotten it wrong. All right. How about this one? When first published, how many copies of Fellowship of the Ring were published in its first run? In its very first printing?
So its first printing, it's going to be mostly England.
Mm-hmm.
How many copies were printed? How about Dan goes first this time?
How many copies were in the first print run of Fellowship of the Ring?
Yeah, 1954.
230,000.
No. 85,000.
85,000. All right. Well, this one, you guys are off by an even greater factor. It's only 1,500.
Oh.
1,500.
Okay.
Yeah. It did okay. And I think even the Two Towers might have been 1,000. I'd have to look that up, but I think the Two Towers or the Return of the King were even less than 1,500 in the first run because it didn't. I don't
Okay,
think
we're
it really
talking
took off.
what is this? 53?
54 was when Fellowship was published.
Okay, 54.
Yeah. So pretty low amount. I mean, maybe the second one happened.
That's
2
a
weeks
really
later.
tiny amount.
Yeah. And
I
so
wonder where the distribution was.
yeah, I don't know offhand, but that was the very first run. So that's why, like, if you find a first run copy of Fellowship of the Ring, you're going to be paying a lot for it. A lot. All right. Next question. How many languages has the Lord of the Rings been translated into? How many languages? Not how many translations, because there are some languages that have had multiple translations, but how many actual languages has it been translated into?
37.
85.
Oh, wow. Dan, no, you're not right. I think you got to abandon the 85 here now. Michael, though, the actual number is 38.
Wow.
Oh, all right.
That's including awesome languages like Marathi, which is an Indian dialect of some sort, or dialect or a whole language, I'm not sure. Esperanto, which, if you're familiar with that, that's a made-up language from the 1800s. And even Galician, right? That's a part of Spain, I think, that with its own language, dialect.
So I'm close enough for government work.
Yeah. Yeah. And you would have won the Price is Right at 37 and not 39. All right. And so this one's a little bit different. How many Lord of the Rings video games have been published so far? And Michael, what's the best one?
I can tell you what the best one is, and I can also tell you what the worst one is.
Oh, all right. I'd like to hear that. There are some bad ones, particularly when they were based on the films.
Wonder if they're counting the volumes or different, new volumes of the same game, which they probably are for Shadow of Mordor.
Probably.
Okay, I'll say 19.
19. It's not 85, Dan.
I'll go with 20.
20.
He's learning.
He's wanting to play the game. The actual answer is 32.
Yes.
I mean, this includes like mobile games and stuff like this. So.
Oh, I didn't even think about that. Well, there's one. Yeah, in my mind, the most true to Tolkien's world is Lord of the Rings Online, which has been going now for 14, 15 years.
15 years, I think. It's been a long time.
And it's really impressive how much the team loves Tolkien's Middle Earth and tries to stay true to what they got. So and then one of the worst, maybe not the worst, because I haven't played all 32 of these games, would have to be the Shadow of Mordor.
If you don't consider it a Lord of the Rings game, it's fun.
That's right.
But it's interesting.
But as it turns out, it's a perversion of everything that Tolkien wrote. So there's that.
It's going to take over orcs. Yeah, no. It was it had its it was sort of like Assassin's Creed in Orkland. Not the greatest game, but it had its non-Tolkien merits, I guess.
And
at least
yet,
in my book.
Funnily enough, the Celebrimbor in that game still better than the Celebrimbor in Rings of Power.
Right. Oh my goodness. We should do a comparison at some point and see what we end up with. Who do we like better? Which, from the worst video game or hopefully not the worst Lord of the Rings on the silver screen, or Middle Earth.
Who do we hate least?
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we can move on to something.
You just got to give it a chance. It might be good.
Right.
Sure. I'll give it a chance. So you're saying there's a chance?
There's a chance.
So you're telling me there's a chance? Right after she said,
"We'll see." Hey, man,
a million maybe.
Yeah. You can skim, if they can skim that little 1 inch of cream right off the top of whatever it is that they're figuring out. Maybe it'll end up. Anyway, we'll see when it comes out. But before it comes out, we still have plenty of the Silmarillion to go through. So before we do, and we jump into the meat of this, we want to hear
Dan's Big Thought.
All right, my big thought this week on Feanor and the Unchaining of Melkor. Really, this chapter is about two characters, and my big thought is that they're really quite similar. Well, at least in this regard, that that they don't seem to respect the authority structures that are around them. And so, for example, Feanor, he doesn't seem to respect Finway's decision to remarry and have other kids. And so Feanor ends up kind of pouting. He just kind of lives all by himself. He's living apart from his family. He doesn't recognize his family. He doesn't. He basically doesn't respect the decision that his dad, who is the king of the Noldor, made. I think that that amount of pride or that amount of arrogance of Feanor, that he's just not willing to submit to what the power structures that he finds himself surrounded by. He starts to become puffed up with pride. He starts to think that he's better than other people, better than other elves, better than the Valar even.
Yeah.
And so I think you see that parallel with Melkor as well, that they both will just push whatever is in their way out of their way so they can do what they want.
And they both have an affinity to flame as well.
Huh. That's a good point. I hadn't thought about it that way. Obviously the pride of Feanor comes into play in the further chapters, which we'll eventually see.
Yeah,
that's a really good point. Pride is a great downfall of many people, and that will certainly come to fruition moving forward.
And one of my favorite quotes in this chapter that I think Tolkien wrote, showing that about Melkor, is that you see him in contrast with the other Valar. That the other Valar, when Manwë decides to pardon Melkor and unchain him, that the other Valar, they're all standing around going, "What? Like, how can you do that?" But they also submit to Manwë's decision. They realize that he is the authority. And so I think Tolkien writes that those who defend authority against rebellion must not themselves rebel. So the Valar recognize that they are under authority and they have to submit to that.
Right, and we see a lot of interesting differences between the different Valar, even in those couple of paragraphs that you last referenced, Dan. What I've always found interesting is that we have Mandos keeping silent in this particular matter, and this is the Valar who knows more than any other Valar, including presumably Manwë, because Mandos is the spokesperson. He speaks only when Manwë desires him to, essentially pronounce doom or judgment, or I suppose you can't say that that's the only time he speaks, but that is his role and responsibility. So he clearly can see some of the ends anyway of letting Melkor go unchained, and he keeps silent. You have Nienna arguing for his release because of her compassion and mercy, because Melkor has apparently served 3 ages inside of the halls of Mandos alone, whatever that means.
Yeah, I know. When you think 3 ages in the Lord of the Rings and Tolkien, you think the first age, the second age, and the third age. And if he were to serve those 3 ages, that's not the same amount of time.
Yeah, this is all prior to the technical first age. Well, I guess the first age started with the elves, right? So
maybe they had 3 really big parties, and the 3 ages are for each.
They
of those
had
parties.
Their quinceanera. They had their
while Melkor looked on with dismay from his spot.
Yeah.
I don't know what those 3 ages are, but Tulkas is angry about the idea of him being released. Olmo argues against it, but is overruled by Manwë. Manwë, it says, he just doesn't understand evil. So he has compassion for his brother. And he doesn't understand the evil that's in Melkor's heart, which is an interesting quality of Manwë, because he is closest to the heart and mind of Iluvatar. We were told in a previous chapter, which is he's the most noble of all the Valar, and he's the closest in mind to Iluvatar, and this makes him fit to be king, so to speak. But in this matter of Melkor, he fails.
So that's interesting, because then by parallel, right, he would also not understand Feanor and Feanor's own pride and his the ill choices he makes that are selfish, because that's not in his character either, and he can't quite see that in Feanor either. And so when he meets out these punishments, right now that we see, that happens with the 3 ages of Melkor here. And then when he casts out Feanor as well, right? It's because he doesn't know how to deal with it in the best possible way. And how could the Noldor actually like disdain the Valar for forcing them in a way to come over to Valinor? Perhaps he doesn't get it.
Yeah, I mean, at a certain point, I'm gonna have to break out all my list, but before of where the Valar failed.
Yeah,
but, that'll be down the line once we get to the end of the first age, maybe. But this is definitely a failure on the part of their king, if not some of the other Valar. One of the things that stands out the most about Feanor, we were first introduced to him by him being the cause of the death of his mother, right? So
right.
He has this fire in him that's so great, and he basically received it from his mother, and his mother, in giving him the flame that is in him, this burning fire, which will help make him anyway one of the greatest elves to ever lived in terms of power, knowledge, and ability.
And which Tolkien uses the same phrase that he uses when it comes to the creation of the world, which is the secret fire, right? And he says that all his love he gave thereafter to his son Finwë gave to Feanor, and Feanor grew swiftly as if a secret fire were kindled within him, which harkens back to the creation of the world and harkens back to what was written before this, or what was published before this in The Lord of the Rings, where Gandalf says, I'm a servant of the secret fire. And it's kind of cool how that the tie-ins happen early here in the Silmarillion still.
Right. And it's interesting because that is, obviously Feanor has received this gift from Iluvatar. I mean, the secret fire is what Melkor sought in order to have true creation and could never possess. Only Iluvatar has it. And so using that phrase about Feanor was really telling, because it shows that there's this fire of creation in him. And we see that with his creations, and there's some really interesting aspects to it. I'm just going to read a passage about his abilities. And this is right after the secret fire quote that you gave, and after his physical appearance. It says, "Few ever changed his courses by counsel, none by force. He became of all the Noldor then or after the most subtle in mind and the most skilled in hand. In his youth, bettering the works of Rumiel, he devised those letters which bear his name." So this is language. So he's responsible for the language of the Eldar, and which the Eldar ever use after. And by language, I mean written language and runes.
Yeah.
And it was he who first of the Noldor discovered how gems greater and brighter than those of the earth might be made with skill. So he's actually creating gems, not just mining them out of the earth like a dwarf. The first gems that Feanor made were white and colorless, but being set under starlight, they would blaze with blue and silver fires brighter than Halloween. And the other crystals he made also, wherein things far away could be seen small but clear, as with the eyes of the eagles of Manwë. Seldom were the hands and mind of Feanor at rest. So it's describing the Palantiri here, the Seen stones, which have a prominent place in Lord of the Rings, or not. It will have a prominent place in second and third book. So this is a consummate craftsman, a consummate creator. He in fact makes things as like gems and Palantiri and other and language itself, and he's burning with this fire of creation that can't be dimmed.
And after that, which is interesting, right? So his desire to create isn't only it's not only set within the ability to actually create the Silmarils. He actually wants to, instead of understand minds, he would rather master those as well. So rather than understanding the world around him, right, he would create the Silmarils. Rather than understanding the people around him, he would try to master them. The line being, his wife Nurdinel was also firm of will, but more patient than Feanor, desiring to understand minds rather than to master them, which essentially saying Feanor decided to master them. And at first she restrained him when the fire of his heart grew too hot, but his later deeds grieved her and they became estranged. Feanor, I mean, the fire of his heart, right? That's something we see again right there with the secret fire, and that his desires, like you were saying, Dan, right at the beginning with your big thought that it was too hot, right? And it's something then tying back to Manwë that he probably couldn't quite understand.
So there's another thing I want to point out here, which is that off of the creations of Feanor, which is that this is the beginning of a theme which is going to stay constant throughout Silmarillion and through the rest of the writings, even The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. What I'm thinking of is chronologically in the Middle-earth's history, not chronologically as written. But that's the theme, contrary to our current world, that the things that came first and were made first are the best. So in our world, we think of things as progress as improving things. So the farther we go and the more we improve things technologically, the better they get. Although there are plenty of jokes about, I have a stove in my house that's from the 1950s, and it is the best stove ever. It's this monstrous beast, about 700 pounds, I think, but it cooks well. It is reliable. It makes the best. It has this copper plating on the top. Makes the best pancakes you'll ever.
There's no like Bluetooth with it that I can't start it when I'm at Target.
We had so much trouble with the supposedly superior technological advances. So in a way, I a little bit understand what Tolkien's talking about in a very small domestic way. But there's a truth in Tolkien's world. The things that were best came first, and the deeds of the elves and the creations. Even though the creation of arms and armor, as we'll see next chapter, was a cause of strife and a result of the lies of Melkor, their craft was the best craft that there was. I'm reminded of The Hobbit when they Gandalf and the dwarves and Bilbo, after defeating the trolls, they have these two swords they bring to Rivendell, and Elrond identifies them as Glamdring and Orcrist as swords from Gondolin in the first age. And immediately those are the swords that are going to use. And this is like something that these swords were made like 3,000 years ago. If we found a sword that was made 3,000 years ago, it would be the last thing you'd want to use to defend yourself. But in Tolkien's world, the swords that were made 3,000 years ago were, of course, way better than anything you're going to find around that was made in the current day. And so this is a theme in Tolkien, which is, what came first is best.
It's like a philosophical conservatism, like just fundamentally conservative.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I guess you could see that also in what they built when it comes to the cities that are described in Valinor, and even going down to Orthanc, which was built far earlier than even that wasn't built before Gondor. That was built with Gondor, but it was built with the technicians of the Númenóreans, right? And so Orthanc
is one made from that black stone that the walls of Minas Tirith are. There's this great passage in the end of the Two Towers when, or not the end, but in the Two Towers, where Wormtongue chucks the Palantir out and at Gandalf and at Nero or at they're not sure. Maybe he was aiming for Saruman, they thought, but anyway, he chucks the Palantir out, and the Palantir, this what looks like a glass globe, comes crashing down and actually cracks the black stone, which is of the steps of Orthanc. So you have a perfect example of what is best being made first. The Palantir is the oldest thing in that scene, aside from Gandalf and Saruman themselves, and so that's the craft that it can break even the black stone, that even the Ents who can carve through regular stone walls, like, and I quote Tolkien, like fingers through bread, can't touch that black stone. That black stone of the Númenóreans is impenetrable to them. But this Palantir is superior even to that stone.
Which is,
the second
bringing it back to this chapter, is talked about as something that Feanor essentially built.
Feanor creates that Palantir that Grima Wormtongue chucks at Gandalf. So it's a clear example of the things made first are superior.
Well, speaking of things made first, I mean, I guess we'll come up on that in the next chapter with when the first weapons were actually made, and we'll see that those weapons, just like you said with Glamdring and Orcrist, right? Those probably would still be quite lethal if they had existed when Merry and Pippin ended up using them or needing them, and Gandalf. So while the first, large part of this chapter deals with Feanor, another part of it deals with what happened to Melkor. And we talked already about the 3 ages that he endured based on Manwë's decree of, I guess his imprisonment for that amount of time.
Right.
But Manwë granted him pardon after that. And he was, I guess you could say Sauron took a page from his book in the Second Age when he decided to be Anatar, the giver of gifts, and be a nice guy. And here, Melkor does the same thing where, let's see, I love the line where he talks about Melkor and what he was doing. So Tolkien wrote, "But fair seeming were all the words and deeds of Melkor in that time after that Manwë pardoned him after his imprisonment for 3 ages. And both the Valar and the Eldar had profit from his aid and counsel if they sought it." So not only was he now seemingly a good guy, he was actually helping people out. There's no specificity to what he was doing, but they had profit from it. And I thought that I never really noticed that in earlier readings, that he was doing good in a way if they had profit from it. And so Melkor, he pulled the wool over their eyes, and he was pretending to be, the guy everybody liked. He's the protagonist's good friend who turns out betraying him in the cheap Roland Emmerich movie. But,
That's right. That's right. Well, and we see here an echo. This is a classic Tolkien thing to do. So this is the first echo, which is going to be repeated again by Sauron as Anatar, of him teaching the Noldor something. It says, "But the Noldor took delight in the hidden knowledge that he," that's Melkor, "could reveal to them, and some hearkened to words that it would have been better for them never to have heard. Melkor indeed declared afterwards that Feanor had learned much art from him in secret, and had been instructed by him in the greatest of all his works. But he lied in his lust." So that last part is a lie, that the greatest of all his works, which we're going to talk about next chapter with the Silmarils, those were Feanor's creation. But it is true that Melkor did indeed teach the Noldor about craft and hidden knowledge. And so he's giving them what is objectively a good thing. Knowledge, at least, is of some things, and so he can do what it takes. Melkor can, to pull the wool over people's eyes for a time, anyway.
What's also interesting, other than the point that Melkor was a nice guy, one of the lines in the second half after sort of the division point in this chapter is the point that the noontide of Valinor was drawing to its close, which means that we're halfway done in the history, in a way, right? That means that, I guess maybe you could say the noontide also means the high point, the brightest, most beneficial time. But right. I think that's also a point that, like, man, there's in the time span of Middle Earth, we're almost at the halfway point, and we've barely touched all these stories that Tolkien came up with, which I found interesting.
We don't know how long the ages were before this, and doubtless they were of quite a few days, years, centuries, probably, thousands, millennia. But yeah, we're about to get to what we find to be the interesting part.
Yeah, it's a short chapter, but it sort of lays out the character of Feanor, the character of Melkor, the ways that he, the deception that he continues to create, and birth in the Noldor, and we'll see that come to fruition.
Dan, when we were talking about this earlier, you had mentioned something about how you saw some parallels between what's happening, what's going on here at the beginning with Feanor and the Genesis story a little bit. Maybe we'll continue this in the next chapter discussion in the next chapter. But Feanor almost seems to have the seed of his. You have his pride as the seed of his downfall being kind of hinted at here.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I don't even know if it's hinted at. It's sort of, it's well, if it's a hint, it's the kind that
pretty obvious.
Yeah, you definitely have that that seed, as you call it, of that pride of like, I'm going to listen to my own counsel. I'm going to listen to what I think is best. And then you have the tempter who's coming into the garden, so to speak, and he's going to tell him exactly, you know what, you're right. You are better than everyone else. You know what, you're right. You are smarter than everyone else. What you really need to do is you need to be free. You need to listen to me, and I'll help you be free. And so
that's exactly right. And
it's an interesting parallel.
Yeah. So we'll talk more about that in the next chapter.
All right. Well, let's move on to the next chapter then. But before we do that, let's do our favorite.
If you like Tolkien.
And today, I have the one book that a lot of people don't read because they're like letters. Who wants to read somebody's letters? But we have the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien, which is a great. I have multiple copies here. Every copy I could get, apparently. And so 3 different copies. But I love my original, like my early one best. It looks cool. Anyway, but it's great to go through it and find the incredible quotes that Tolkien had that that now are being used in awful ways to justify some things with Amazon's Rings of Power and taken out of context. But if you ever want to read into his thoughts on the motivations of some characters or his thoughts on Numenor and Valinor and all these sorts of things, I would definitely highly recommend getting the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien. It's not something you like pick up and read through like a novel, but picking it up, reading some letters and going through it from front to back is really interesting because it starts out with where he's, I believe, in World War I, one of his earliest letters. Let's see here. 1914 to Edith Bratt, who became his wife. So, you get the whole picture of who he was. And he's talking about, I like this quote in the very first letter where he's talking about the birth of Middle-earth in a way. And he writes, amongst other work, he writes to Edith, amongst other work, I'm trying to turn one of the stories, which is really a very great story and most tragic, into a short story, somewhat on the lines of Morris romances with chunks of poetry in between. Which didn't turn into a short story, I don't think, whatever that is, but it's most tragic, perhaps. That's Fall of Gondolin. That was one of his early ones. But it's neat to see that, right? That's 1914, and we're in 2022 now. And so knowing that this was published 68 years later in the Silmarillion, no, 70 years later, 73 years later. No, wait, 63 years later. Boy, my math. We're reading, we're not doing math here. But yeah, so when they published Silmarillion, right, you see like the germs of those stories in some of his letters here. So highly recommended. I would pick up a copy. It's fun.
So it's got good dating advice in there. If you want to woo a woman, you talk to her about your Pokemon cards or your video games. And for Tolkien, it was, hey, I'm creating a big fantasy world. And
if that worked for you, Dan, that's great.
Perhaps not universally applicable, but
I don't think he was talking about Pokemon cards, but yeah. So anyway, pick up a copy. And next week we'll get into chapter 7, which is of the Silmarils and the unrest of the Noldor, which should be exciting because that's the namesake of the entire book, the Silmarillion. So we'll see, what Feanor does with the Silmarils and how his pride and fire end up creating a tragedy that runs through all the way till the end of the Third Age. So thanks for following us. Make sure you subscribe if you're listening to this. If you're on YouTube watching this, then go ahead and subscribe there, like there, comment there. We'd love to hear your thoughts and see what you think about this. And we'll see you next week.
Michael, Dan, and Jonathan want to thank you, the listener, for joining us. Visit us at theonering.com, your source for everything Tolkien, where you can comment on this episode and join the conversation. This is Austin Robertson, bidding you farewell. May the wind under your wings bear you where the sun sails and the moon walks.